How's it going, everyone? So I wanted to show you how to build a simple MERN to-do application, which has a really basic authentication in front of it, right? So I am going to show you how this application works, and then we're going to build out the back end using Express and Mongo and Mongoose, and then we're going to build the front end using React, Vite, React Router DOM, and a couple of other packages that you might find interesting, such as React Query. So if that's kind of interesting to you, be sure to stick around and watch this whole tutorial. So starting off, we have a login page, and if you were to type in something incorrect for the password, you're going to get a login failed error. The password happens to be ABC in this case, so I'm going to type that in and click login. And if you successfully enter the right password, you're going to log in and go to the actual to-do list application. I didn't spend too much time styling this stuff, so don't judge me too hard. But as you click on checkboxes and delete stuff, you can see that this is actually making backend requests to our Express application, which is going to do some authentication and make sure that the person making the request is authenticated and they actually have permission to create different to-do items. So if you look at this to-do request, you can see here that we are passing some authentication in the authorization header. So I'm going to kind of show you how you can get that all set up. And hopefully you can learn a little bit more about building out a full stack application using the MERN stack. Let's just go ahead and look into the code and get started. So when it comes to building out full stack applications, I personally like to start with the backend just so that I have endpoints I can hit to, store and retrieve data. So let's just go ahead and start with building out the Express API, and then we'll move on later to building out the React front end that'll connect to it. So I have my VS Code editor open up to a folder called MERN to do. And inside of this directory, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder called server. I like to separate my server and my client into two separate folders. And once you've created that server folder, I'm going to go ahead and in my terminal, I'm going to go ahead and say cd server, and that'll kind of make sure that I'm put into that directory. Okay, so if you're not really familiar with the terminal, you can open it by doing a Control tilde on Mac, but if you look at your actual home page here in VS Code, it'll tell you like what command you need to do. So if you open that up, go to terminal and type in pwd, this will print out your current working directory in your terminal. So make sure that you are in that server folder because we're going to run some commands that need to be ran inside the server folder. So once we're here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do npm init-y. And what this is going to do is it's using a tool called Node Package Manager. That's what the npm stands for. And that's going to set up a file called package.json. So what npm is, it's basically a tool for downloading and updating third-party dependencies for your project. In this tutorial, we're going to be using something called Express and a couple of other packages. So we need to tell our program how to fetch those from the internet and install them on our computer so that we can use them. And the reason we do this is because you don't want to try writing a REST API by hand because it's a lot of work. We try to leverage tools that have already been built by other developers, and it kind of facilitates our ability to create REST APIs and front ends. All right, so let's just take a peek at what this package.json looks like. It's kind of a JSON file. This is just a data description that kind of explains what third-party libraries your package needs or your program needs. And then this is an important section, the script section. This is kind of a list of things or commands you can run that kind of gets your application running. We'll talk about this in just a second. But what we're going to do is that there's a couple of third-party dependencies that we need to install that we can build out an Express REST API. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy in a command, and this command npm I, the I stands for install, --save means it's going to take all these dependencies and it's going to put them in that package.json here. All right, so we have a lot of dependencies we need, and I'm going to talk about these as we start using them. So let's just go ahead and run the command by doing enter, and you'll see it starts doing a lot of stuff. It's going to fetch all of these dependencies from a third-party website called npm, and it's going to install all of those tools into a folder called Node Modules. So if you open this up, you'll notice that you have hundreds of different third-party libraries now inside of this folder. And all of these are really useful for building out this Express API. For the most part, you don't have to look into this Node Modules folder. You can just kind of leave it alone. but it's good to know that it's there and what its purpose is. So once you've done that, it's going to create a new file called package.lock and also update this package.json. So if you look at the package.json, all those dependencies I just tried installing are now put here. So you can see we have cores.env, express, etc. And then to the right, we actually have the version numbers of these packages. So over the months and years, these packages will get updates. Some of these will be, bug fixes, and some of them will be major updates. So this is kind of like a Simber approach to keeping track of what version of what package you're using. So when you run this, you might have a different version number here, but for the most part, you can kind of update these version numbers and not have too many issues as the months go by and there's new packages that are released of these. But I don't want to get too much into the weeds of npm. There's also this package lock. Basically, this is saying that whenever you do an npm install in the future, make sure that you try to get the exact same versions, because again, if you were to rerun this and it downloads newer versions, your stuff could just break, right? So this is why we use npm and we use the package.json and the package lock. Again, for the most part, you don't need to worry about the package lock. It's kind of all automated and behind the scenes. So now at this point, what we can do is I'm going to make a new folder in the server folder called source. I like to put all of my source files inside of a source folder. And this is a common convention you'll see used by other developers as well. And inside of this source folder, I'm going to go ahead and create a new file called Index.js. When you're dealing with Node, Index.js is kind of special. This is kind of like your entry point for your application. When I say entry point, I mean it's like the first file that runs, that kind of sets up everything that you need. So we're going to be doing the entry point here with Index.js. And what we want to do is we want to build out a Express API, right? So we already have those packages kind of set up locally, and those all exist in the Node modules folder, and we need to import them into our Index.js, right? So when you're doing Node, there's a package management system called common.js, and this allows you to use a keyword require to bring in some third-party dependencies. So I'm going to do const to declare a new constant variable. I'm going to say express, and I'm going to say equals require express. Okay, so that is going to basically load in that third-party library. If I were to look at the Node modules folder and search for express, notice that there is a folder called express. What this is doing is basically saying go into that folder and load in whatever library files that we might need from this. And then if we were to kind of run this, let me just go ahead and console log. This is going to basically print out. Let's just go ahead and run this file. To run a file in Node, you just do node space and then the path to the file. So I'm going to say index source/index.js. So if you notice here, this prints out a bunch of random stuff, right? So we have a bunch of methods that we can use from this Express library, and we're going to use some of them in a bit, but there is some setup that we need to do to get this Express stuff fully working. So first, let's just go ahead and make a new application. So I'm going to say const app is equal to express, and you call it like a function. So this is going to set up a Express server that you can start configuring, and we will do the configuration in just a second. So I'll just put a comment, say to do configure the app. And then at the bottom, we can actually say app.listen, and we can provide a port number. So if you're not really familiar with servers, a port number is basically a slot on your computer that you can access a service or a server. This will make more sense in a second when we actually try to access it. So now that we have this kind of set up, we can actually run this again. So if I do node source index.js, notice that the application just kind of sits there. This is because this is actually running a web server now. So if I were to go over to another tool I have installed called Postman, and I'm going to make a new request here, so I can go ahead and do a new HTTP request. I highly recommend installing Postman. It's really convenient to kind of test your REST APIs. I'm going to go ahead and make a request to localhost 8080. And I want to show you that we do get some type of response back because there is a server running at that port. Remember, we set the port to 8080, but you could have set this to whatever. I could have done like 5000. If I try to hit 5000, I don't really get a response back because there is no web server running at port 5000. if I went back and changed this to 5,000, we'd actually get a response back. So let's just keep this at 8080 so we can continue exploring how to build out this REST API. So let's try to add a endpoint. Okay, so when we talk about REST APIs, typically you hit them with different endpoints. So if I go back to Postman, we should basically be able to do a GET request to /todos. And we want that to return all the to-dos that have been created in the database and persisted, right? So if we try to hit this with a GET request, let me explain what this is. So there's different HTTP requests you can do. There's GET, POST, PUT, PATCH, DELETE, and a bunch more. We are going to be using these to kind of change how our backend responds based on what we send in. This is really important for dealing with REST APIs because all of these methods, we kind of have a different convention that we follow for what they do. So a GET request on a URL like this, a /todos, should return an array of all of the to-dos that are in our database, right? So if I do send, notice that again, we get back an error because we don't have that endpoint set up. Let me go ahead and just add that endpoint, right? So if you go into your Index.js and I do app, there's a couple of methods you can do. You can do GET, you can do a POST, you can do a PUT, you can do a patch. Again, these methods all correlate to these methods here. But what we want to do is we want to do a GET request. So I'm going to go ahead and say GET, and then I can provide the path. So in this case, I'm going to say to-dos. And then the second argument that we're going to provide is going to be a callback function. So I'm going to say rec in res. And basically what this is doing is anytime someone hits this /todos, so kind of like I just showed here, /todos, it's going to call this function. And then we have the ability to grab things that came in the request. This is what the REQ stands for. It's a request object. And we also have the ability to send some data back with the response object. So I'm going to go ahead and say res for response. And I'm going to say send, and I'm going to say hello world, something like that. And again, I'm just showing you how Express kind of works. So we made a new endpoint where if a user does a to-do list request on it, we should get back a message that says hello world. Now there's one issue. When I save this file, it doesn't actually restart the web server. So if I go back and do this request, it's still going to fail because we haven't restarted our server and the changes haven't really been included. So you have to stop this with a command C or control C and then rerun it. But you'll notice that this becomes really tedious because you have to keep on restarting your server every time you make changes. So I'm going to go ahead and install another dependency here. So I'm going to say npm I -save -dev, and I'm going to say Nodemon. So Nodemon is a tool you can use to just kind of restart your API as you save your files and make changes. It's super convenient, and I definitely recommend that you get it set up. The -save dev is telling package.json that this is a dev dependency. So when you're actually running this on production, you don't need to install something called Nodemon. So let's look at the package.json. I'm going to show you there's a separate dev dependencies here. This is where Nodemon's kind of like documented. Again, so this is like for when you're running in production, but go to the script section. We are going to rename this test script to start. And I'm going to kind of copy and delete all this code here. And I'm going to run Nodemon source/index.js. So what this script tag allows us to do is we can run custom commands down in our terminal. So I can say npm run, and then you can type in the name of whatever command that you have in this script. So you could do like imagine if there's another thing called test here, right? Then I could say npm run test, or I could say npm run start. In our case, we just want to npm run start this, so that'll basically start up Nodemon over our server and keep on refreshing it whenever we make changes. So you'll see this thing print out. And the cool thing is if I go back to my index.js and save this file, Nodemon will see that I actually saved the file and it'll restart it for me. So it said restarting to do the changes and stuff like that. So now if I were to hit this endpoint with Postman over here, notice that we get back a message that says hello world. And I can go into the code and I can like change this and save it. And within about a second or less, our API will refresh and we will see those changes come back. So congratulations, you just built your first Express API that takes a GET request response to a /todos endpoint. So there's a couple of other packages I want to kind of get set up. Remember when we did the npm install, we installed a bunch of other third-party libraries. So I'm going to kind of get these set up because we're going to need these to actually build out a real REST API that connects to MongoDB. Let me just kind of walk you through some of this stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do is there is a package called .env, and we are going to set that up to basically allow our application to be easily configured from an external file, okay? And I'll explain what that means in just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and require this file in, and I'm going to say .env.config and run it. So what this is going to do is this is a package that actually goes to your source directory or to your server folder, and it's going to look for a file called .env. So I'm going to create a file called .env, and what we're going to do is add a key here called Mongo URI, and I'm just going to put hello here for right now, just to show you what happens. And the purpose of this is that when you're running on different machines, you might have different configurations that your application might need. So for an example, when you're running locally on your laptop, you might need to connect to a MongoDB that's locally. Or in our case, in this tutorial, we're going to connect to a remote MongoDB URI. So we need to actually put a URL to a Mongo database here. And the purpose of this, again, is so that our application can easily be configured from the outside. Instead of having to go through all the code and find every reference to that MongoDB URI, you can just change it in one place. So when we do that, what we can do is we can console log that variable out, and you can say process.env.mongo URI. So this is how you can access what we are calling environment variables. This is called an environment variable that I've set here, and we're trying to be able to access that value here. So if I save this file, you'll notice that it prints out hello, okay? And I can easily just go into this env file, and I can add whatever I want to it. And when I save it, I might actually have to go back and save, I might have to save this file so it actually refreshes, but you'll notice that when this application reloads, that environment variable is going to have exclamation marks, okay? So use your imagination. This is important to kind of know how to configure your application. There's also another one called Morgan that we're going to install. So Morgan is a logging library that you can kind of attach to your Express application. And that just allows you to kind of get some additional feedback for when you make requests to your endpoint. So in order to use Morgan, I kind of have to talk about middleware functions in Express. So the Express library kind of allows you to put functions to be called in front of these other endpoints, right? So to kind of explain this, I'm going to do app.use, and I'm going to go ahead and just put Morgan and then put Teeny in here, okay? So what this is doing is saying before this code runs, we want to tell Express to always run everything that this code does. Okay, behind the scenes, if you were to look at this code, it probably just looks like this. It's like a function that has rec and res, but it's doing some additional stuff to console log the request out. All right, so let's go back over the Postman. I want to show you if I do a request here and go back to my terminal, you'll see that it actually prints out what request was done to which endpoint, what status code was returned, how long did it take to run, etc. So you get some additional feedback. This is called logging, and this is really important when you're running on a production system because you want to know when users made certain requests to certain endpoints. Did those endpoints fail or did they work? How long did those endpoints take to run in case you want to come back and do some performance tuning? But we're just doing this so we can kind of like get better debugging logic. So I think there's a couple of other packages that we might need to install. For right now, we just need to set up cores. So there is another library called cores. So I'm going to say const cores is equal to require cores. And this works the same way as Morgan. It's a middleware function that's going to run before like you ever hit your actual endpoints. So I'm going to say app.use, and then I'm going to call cores like this. This I'll explain later, but basically your browser prevents you from hitting APIs that don't have the same domain. And in our case, we're going to be hosting our React app on port 3000, but our API is running on port 8080. So you're going to run into some issues unless you actually enable cores with like a star wildcard. I won't get too much into that. trying to keep it simple, but we just need this so that we can actually like work on this tutorial. And then I think that's kind of all we want to do for right now. We're going to connect to Mongoose in a bit. Yeah, so let's just go ahead and try to implement a basic login endpoint. So the idea behind this to-do list application is that this is all behind some type of authentication. We don't want anyone just creating and updating to-do list items. You want to be authenticated. So we need to add a login endpoint. So I'm going to restructure this a little bit. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go ahead and change this endpoint to /login. And we are going to do a actual post request here. Okay. So we're just changing like the endpoint in the method. And before we, add too much into this file, we want to keep this code a little bit more organized. So inside the source folder, I'm going to make a new folder called routes. And I'm going to go ahead and also make a new file here called router.js. So typically in Express, to keep your code organized and manageable, you want to keep your router and your routes like separated. So I'm going to go ahead and say const express is equal to require express here. Again, you can kind of just import these third-party libraries in whatever folders that you want. And I'm going to say const router is equal to, I think it's like express.router. So this is going to create what we call an express router, and you can actually attach things to this directly, right? So instead of doing app.get down here, I'm actually going to cut this code out, and I'm going to put it inside this router folder. And I'm going to say router.post instead. Okay. And then once we've done this, I'm going to show you another thing that might be new to you. We're going to export this router object from this file. Okay, so when you're doing common.js or Node.js development, there's ways to have your files export objects or export strings so that other files can use them, right? This is called like making a module. So I'm going to say module.exports is equal to router. And what this allows us to do is now if we go back to the index.js, we can actually import that file. So I'm going to say const router is equal to require./router. Okay, so we haven't done this yet, but this is how you can import other files that exist in your Node application. You just have to make sure you have a / so that it knows it's a file and not an actual like Node modules package. So this is going to load in that router file here. Okay, that's going to load in this thing. And we need to use this express router object and put it into another middleware. So I'm going to say app.use, and then I'm going to pass it router. And what this should do is basically allow us to put all of our route definitions in a different file just to keep our code a little bit cleaner. So hopefully this works. We should be able to do a post request to /login, and we should get a hello world back. So going over the postman, I'm going to go ahead and change this to post. I'm going to go ahead and do a login endpoint and keep our fingers crossed. If I do a send, we get back a 200 status code and a message that says hello world. So everything is working just like it did before, just with a different endpoint, and we kind of restructured the code to make it a little bit cleaner. So a second thing I like to do to keep the code cleaner is we are going to go into that routes folder here, and I'm going to make a new folder called a login route. Again, we are experts at creating node modules now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut out this code. And I'm going to put it in that login route here. So I'm going to say module.exports is equal to that function. And then what I'm going to do inside the router is you can actually just require that directly here if you wanted to. So I'm going to do ./routes/login route. Okay. So now we're actually saying this login endpoint is actually going to use the module that's exported from the login route. Now everything we're doing here is just to try to keep the code clean and maintainable. So let's just make sure this still works. If I do a request, we still get a response back, so our code still works. One piece of advice I like to give beginners is every time you save a file or you make a one-line change, go ahead and retest your code. Retest your endpoints, retest whatever you're doing, because the earlier you catch the bug you introduced, the easier it is to fix. All right, so the idea is now we have a login route, and we want to basically allow the user to log in with like a hard-coded password. So what I'm going to do for right now is I'm going to go ahead and just verify, like, actually what I'm going to do is inside.env, I'm just going to set up a password of ABC or something. And we are going to verify that the user, when they pass in that password, you get back a special token that says that you're logged in. Okay, so when you're using Express, there is a way to get the payload that was sent over to the user. So for an example, if I go back to Postman, I can go to this body tab and I can change this to raw, and I can go over to JSON here, and I can actually send in some information to the backend, right? So I could type in password and I could send in ABC and click send. And this is going to send that data to the backend, and the backend can actually kind of process that. So if I were to console log rec.body here, I actually think this will print out undefined because there's something we haven't set up yet. So let's just go ahead and look at this. This prints out undefined. So let's go back to Index.js. There is another middleware thing we forgot to set up. I'm going to say app.use express.json. Okay, so in order to process JSON requests, you have to set up this middleware function. So now if I go back and do that request, we should see it print out password of ABC. So this is actually the request that came over from the user. And if I go to that login route, we see that we're printing out the body. So this is how you can get the payload body from the request. And if you use your imagination, you can assume, well, it should be pretty easy to see if the user sent the right password, right? We can say if rec.body.password is equal to process.env.password. Remember, we added password to over here inside the env file. And if they sent the right password, we can kind of say one thing. And if they didn't send the right password, we can say something else. So what we typically do with REST APIs is if someone tries to send in a password and it's wrong, we send back a status code of 401 with like a message. So let me just show you how that works. If I were to send in ABCD here and click send, notice that we get back a 401 all unauthorized and we get a wrong password. Okay, so this is all working. And if you send in the right password, we haven't implemented that logic yet, but we're doing a JWT authentication approach. So we need to actually send back a token. And I'll explain all this in a bit, but I'm gonna go ahead and import a package called JSON Web Token. And if the user sent in the right password, I'm going to go ahead and sign a token. I'm just going to say user ID is like 1 or something. And we're going to sign basically an object with a secret password. Okay, so I'm going to explain all this. Just give me a second. Inside the .env, we're going to set up yet another password. Again, I'm using really insecure passwords. These should be actually like really long and secured. But when you're dealing with JWT, you're basically saying take this object and cryptographically sign it with this secret key, right? So only this REST API knows how to sign and verify these tokens, and you want to send that back to the user here if they typed in the right password. Later, we're going to use this JWT token to kind of verify the user's request so that the endpoints can actually like check to see if the user is logged in. But for right now, let's just go ahead and do that post request and verify that we get back a token, and we also get back a status code of 200. Okay, so we're going to use this token, and I'll explain how this all works later on when we do like other endpoints. All right, so now that we have the ability to kind of log in and get this token, let's kind of look at what this token is. And you'll be surprised this is not as confusing as it might seem. So I'm going to go to a website called JSON Web Token, or sorry, called jwt.io. And if you were to take that token and paste that into this encoded section here, you'll see you get back down here, you get back a payload that has user ID of 1. Let me zoom in a little bit, it might be a little small. So this is the actual like token or the object that we tried to sign. If you go back to the code, remember we signed this object that had a user ID kind of hard coded in it. In the future, like I'm not going to do it in this tutorial, but you're going to be signing more complex user objects that might have like their actual like username, their first name, last name, and a user ID. But typically the JWT has some type of unique identification for the user that you can use later on to kind of look up records based on that user ID. Okay. So I also want to show that this is not like encrypted. Anyone can just look at this code and get the information that's in the payload. So be sure whatever you sign here, like don't put social security numbers in here. Don't put anything that's like private information that you don't want leaked, because this is not encrypted. This is just cryptographically signed. It's like a hash, right? And then I'm not going to talk about like too much into security about this, but just know that there's different algorithms for signing these things and verifying these things. But this is kind of like our key. If you imagine you have a door with a lock on it, this is like the key to your locked door. All right, so we showed you how to create the key and give that back to the user with that login endpoint. But the thing we haven't done yet is how do you actually create a door handle that has a key slot in it that the user can unlock the doors with, right? So if you go back to our index here, let's just go ahead and make a new endpoint. Actually, so let's go to our router and let's go ahead and add another endpoint for getting to the to-dos, right? So I'm gonna say router.get./to-dos, and then I'm gonna require a to-dos route that we haven't created yet. So let's save this file. You should see it crash maybe, but inside of the routes folder, I'm gonna go ahead and create a to-dos route. And then I'm gonna say module.exports is equal to rec res. And then I want to say res.send success. All right, so going back to the router, let's see why this is crashing. I probably forgot to do something. This needs to be router.get, not route. All right, so let's go back to Postman. I want to show you that analogy with the door lock. So if I were to do a GET request, let me go ahead and copy this real quick so I don't lose it. If I do a GET request to to-dos, notice that we get back a response that says success. But the issue is that we actually want to make sure that the user passes in the right token before we give that data back, right? So we are going to move on to adding something called an authorization or authentication middleware function. So I'm going to make a new folder here called middleware. And I'm going to make a new file called isLoggedIn.js. And inside of this file, I'm going to go ahead and say module.export so I can create a new module. We are going to do something like this. This is how you create a express middleware function where you can basically write some code that's going to run before every single endpoint request. All right, so typically how JWT works is you are going to pass that JWT token in the header. So if we go back to Postman, there is a header section. This is just additional data that's sent on every request to the backend. I'm gonna go ahead and add a new one called authorization. This is just the convention that most APIs do. And we are gonna pass in a value of bearer space the token. Again, this is just a convention. But when you click send, it's actually gonna send that header to the backend. So we need the backend to read that and verify the token before it allows us to actually hit the endpoint. So with this middleware function, we can actually get the token by saying request.headers.authorization. And we can actually check if the token is not provided, then we are going to go ahead and send back a status code of 401. And then we can probably just send a message saying like, you must be logged in. Actually, I'm going to say like invalid credentials. So if you don't have the token set, it's going to say invalid credentials. But if you do have it set, we are going to go ahead and we are going to try to verify that token. Remember that we have to actually take, let me rename this. So I want to say auth header. And then inside the else, I'm going to say const token is equal to auth header dot split on the space and give me the first index. Or index 1. So remember, there's a space between bearer and the token. We actually just want to get back this token here and we want to try to verify it. So if I were to kind of console log this right here, console log the token real quick and save this file. Actually, we don't have this set up yet, but let me just kind of do that real quick. So we're in the process of making a middleware function, but we haven't actually told Express to use it. So before your router here, you want to say app.use, and then we could simply just require that is logged in middleware function. right? So basically this is going to run before every single route, basically. Actually, so I kind of did that in the wrong place. Let me actually go to the router. Sorry for hopefully not confusing you all too much. We actually want to put this middleware function only on certain endpoints, right? So we are actually going to import it here. I'm going to say const is logged in is equal to require of ./middleware is logged in. So on the Todos endpoint, I'm going to go ahead and just put that here like this. And now it's going to run that function anytime someone tries to hit that Todos endpoint. Okay, so if I go back and do a request, we should see in the terminal down here, it should print out that token, because the API, this middleware function, is getting that token from the header, right? So at this point, we need to kind of verify the token. Okay, so let's go ahead and import JWT from JSON Web Token. And we need to do something called verifying the token. So I'm going to say jwt.verify. And what we can do is basically pass in the token, pass in that secret key that we set up in our .env file. And if we get an error back, so I'm going to say if error, then we need to say res.status 401 invalid credentials. Actually, this one would be a 403. So there's different status codes when dealing with authentication and authorization. 401 means like you didn't provide the token, or the token is like malformed. 403 means you provided a token, but you don't have access, right? There's something wrong with your token, like maybe you're trying to hack the system or something. But if the token all is good, like there's no errors, then we can just go ahead and call next here. Okay, so that's just going to allow this router to kind of go to the next section, right? So let's show that real quick. If you go to router, if this function calls the next function, it allows Express to move on to the route and run the code. Okay, so if you don't call next, for example, here we didn't call next, then nothing's going to happen. It's just going to send a response back, and then you're going to be done. All right, so let's just verify this. So if we hit this request with the token, let's see if we get success back, and we do. But if you were to turn off this authorization header and hit it, we get back a 401 unauthorized, right? So now this endpoint is protected, and unless you have a token, you can't do anything with it. And also, if you were to try to change a letter here, just to kind of show you what happens, you get back a 403 forbidden because someone's trying to hack your endpoint with a different token. The server expects a particular token that's been cryptographically signed with a certain password, okay? So if someone comes in here and tries to change stuff, it's just not going to work for them. Let me just go ahead and see if I get this working one last time. There we go. So now you've created an endpoint, you've created a middleware. We are successfully protecting that endpoint by using JWT, and that is, I think that's as far as the extent of authentication I'm going to do. You can take this further and like hook this up into, you know, a user database and stuff like that. But I just wanted to add some basic authentication / authorization onto this application. All right, so I think now that we have authentication kind of all set up, the next part of this building out the API is basically hooking up our Express app to actually integrate with Mongo. So before we do that, I do want to kind of show you some setup because I'm using something called Mongodb Atlas. So if you go to cloud.mongodb.com, you can register with like a Gmail account and get a free Mongo cluster. I would recommend doing that. It's probably the easiest way to kind of learn how to deal with Mongo. You could try to run Mongo locally, like using a Docker container, or you can install the Mongo daemon locally if you want to, but it's a little bit more involved and you need to understand how like installing software and running Docker kind of works. So the easiest approach, in my opinion, is just using cloud.mongodb.com. I'm already logged in, so I'm going to go ahead and click Atlas. I'm going to click Build a Database. And I would click on the free database tier and go ahead and click Create. And that'll spin up what is called a cluster, where you can kind of set up different databases inside the cluster. You would probably just keep everything the same. You can rename the cluster like to whatever you want. I can say like my cluster. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to go ahead and say create cluster. And that might take a little bit, but it's going to create that cluster. It says it takes like 3 to 5 minutes. But while that's being created, I'm going to go ahead and create a username. I'll type in admin, and then the password, I'm just going to go ahead and automatically generate one. But I'm going to copy that password and go ahead and click create user. So we have a user called admin, and then we have the password, which I just copied to my clipboard. So while that is provisioning, let's go back over to that .env file, which is what we're going to be putting here. We're going to have to connect to that Mongodb Atlas by putting like a MongoDB URL here. But something that we need to put in the URL is the admin and then the password. Okay, so this happens to be my password. I'm going to delete the cluster /database or user after this tutorial, so don't try to like log in or use this. But when this is actually done provisioning, you can actually get the full URL to accessing this cluster. So we'll come back and check on that in a second. An additional thing that we need to do is that we actually need to import the Mongoose package. So I'm going to say const mongoose is equal to require mongoose. And when our Express application first runs, we need to kind of connect to the Mongo database, right? So the way you can do that is I'm just going to go ahead and scroll down to where do app.listen, because this is the command that actually starts up our web server. We don't want to accept any requests until we successfully connected to the database, right? So what I would do is I would say mongoose.connect, and then we're going to pass in that Mongo URI. Okay, so this is going to allow us to connect to that Mongo database, and that returns a promise. So when it's actually done, we could just simply spin up our Express app. So let's go back and see if this thing is done provisioning. It says my cluster has finished provisioning. I'm going to click finish and close. Actually, you might also have to add your IP address. So click on my current IP and make sure your IP is listed here, or else you won't be able to connect to it. So I'm going to say finish and close. And I'm going to go ahead and go to that database. So once you're here, click on this connect button. And that's going to give you some options. I would say the second one, connect to your application, and it's going to give you an example URL of what you can kind of type in. So notice in this URL, they have a username and password. We already have those kind of copied into that .env file. So let's go here. I'm going to paste in that full thing. And then for username, I'm going to type admin. Make sure you get rid of these little curly braces too, or these brackets, I mean. And for password, I'm going to go ahead and overwrite that. So let's just go ahead and save that .env file. We should be good. Another thing you can also do is you can actually attach the database name. So I'm going to go ahead and just after this .net/, I'm going to say to-do app. Or I could say to-dos. How about that? So I'll show you in a second what this is doing, but it's kind of creating a database called to-dos. I think if you don't do that, it just uses one called test. So just keep that in mind. But now over here, if I were to save this file, it should connect to the Mongo database. And I'm going to go ahead and just put a console log here, say starting on port 8080. And save the file, and if everything is good, we should see it print out starting on port 8080, and then we'll know that we've connected successfully to that Mongo database. So no errors, so I think everything's good. What you can also do is you can see that we have connections equal to 1. So this is kind of showing that our local Express app has successfully connected to that Mongo cluster. So I would just go ahead and say browse collections when you've done that and everything seems like you're connected. And we'll show more about the collections here in a second, but let's go back to the app. So in order to use Mongoose, this is like a library that you can use that really helps connecting to MongoDB. And it just has a lot of utility functions for writing and storing data models, okay? So I'm going to make a new folder here called models. And inside the models folder, I'm going to make one called to-do model.js. All right, so to create a Mongoose model, first I'm going to import Mongoose. So const mongoose equals require Mongoose. And then we can go ahead and create a schema. So I'm going to say to-do schema. you need the schema for kind of defining out like what your data models are going to look like. So if you think about a to-do list item, like what exactly does a to-do list item have? It has some text. So I'm going to say the schema has some text, and then it's a type string. And then you can also have a completed, which is a type Boolean. And I believe you can default this to like false if you wanted to, but we're just going to keep this, as simple as possible. But once you have this schema defined, what you then need to do is you need to register the schema onto Mongoose as like a model. So I'm going to go ahead and say like const to-do model is equal to mongoose.model. You pass it the name of your model that you want, and then you pass it your schema. And then finally, we're going to say module.exports, and we're going to export that to-do model. Okay, so basically what this is allowing us to do is we can import this model into other routes, and then it allows us to basically use this object, which has a bunch of built-in helper methods that kind of create data models and store them on the database, and also retrieve data models from different collections. So let's just kind of first see if this is working. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the to-dos route, and I'm going to rename this to read to-dos route, because if we're going to implement CRUD methods, it would make sense that we kind of name the conventions to match the CRUD methods, especially for a tutorial. So I rename this to read to-dos route, and then I need to make sure that if I go to my router here, I need to refactor this to say read to-dos route. All right. So at this point, what we can kind of do is we can import that data model that we talked about. So I'm going to say const to-do model is equal to require dot slash models to-do model. So I need to give it the like relative path to this file, which I need to go up a directory here, the source, and then back down into models and get the to-do model. So once we have this model, we can actually use it to query the database. So since we're doing the read to-dos route, what this endpoint needs to do is it needs to fetch all of the to-do list items from the database. So I'm going to go ahead and put an async in front of this function so we can use async await. And I'm going to say const to-dos is equal to await to-do model.find. This is going to basically give us back every single to-do list item that's in the database. Luckily, our application's small. We only have one user, so this won't be that bad. But if you have a real production system with a ton of data, you're going to have to limit how many results come back, or maybe do some like finer tuning to query exactly what you need. But since we are just doing it as a tutorial, it's probably fine. And then we're going to send that back to the user like this. So get the to-do list items from the database and then send it back. So let's try to test out this endpoint. I'm going to go back over to this, and assuming that this bearer token still works, I'm going to click send. And we should get back an empty array because we haven't created any to-do list items, right? So at this point, it would make sense to create another route for creating to-do list items. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my routes here, and I'm going to say create to-do route. And go ahead and say module.exports is equal to a function, rec and res, like this. And we need to also import that data model. So let's say to-do model is equal to require, like so. And before we get too into the weeds, I'm going to go into the router, and I'm going to go ahead and put a new endpoint here. So when you're doing when you're creating stuff with REST, typically we use the post method, and we keep the URL like this, right? So you do a post request to/todos. And then we want to call the route create, right? We're trying to do CRUD methods here. So we have create, we have read. Next, we need like update, and then we're going to need a delete, right? So this is going to load in that route that we just created, called create to do route. And this I'm actually getting an error, so let's try to figure out if I have a typo. I do. I have to create to-dos. It should be called to-do, so I had an extra S. Make sure you double check your code when you write it. So let's try to implement this create to do route. So using Mongoose, this Mongoose model, you can actually create using like, class instantiation, you can create a new model. Luckily GitHub Copilot is telling me exactly like what I need to write here. But we're going to assume that the user can send in some text for the to-do list item. So I'm going to go ahead and actually, they kind of explain what I mean by that. So let's say that the user wanted to create a new to-do list item, right? So they'd have to do a post request to that endpoint. And then the user would have to send over some to-do list data, right? So the text could be like, clean your room. So if I were to click that send button, it's going to send over that JSON payload to the backend. The backend needs to take that data and persist it to Mongo somehow, right? So if I go back to this endpoint that we're creating, we need to get that text from the request.body. And I think we've seen how to do that before. So I'm going to go ahead and do like const of text is equal to rec.body. And that is going to give you that text back, right? So if I were to console log this text real quick, I just want to show you that this is actually working. So I'm going to go back to here. I'm going to click send. And we should, in the back end, it prints out clean your room. Right, so we need to take that text and we need to create a new to-do model and then persist it to the database. So I'm going to say const to-do is equal to new to-do model. And then I'm going to pass it in that text. And then I'm also going to say await to-do.save. So this is kind of how you instantiate a new Mongoose model and then you can save it. The moment you run this command right here, it's actually going to store it in your Mongodb Atlas. So basically your live server over here is going to create a record. And then once we've done that, I'm going to go ahead and just keep track of that to-do we just created, and I'm going to send that back like this. It's always good when you're doing the create method of your REST endpoints to send back the newly created record, because this is going to have some unique IDs on it that this one won't have. So you need to make sure that you actually send that back. And it's failing because I forgot to put async here. So let's just go ahead and put async. All right, so let's just go ahead, save this file one more time. And I want to hit that endpoint over here with Postman. And I want to show you that there's no collections right here. If I click refresh, there shouldn't be any collections at all. There is a to-do list database, but I don't think there'll be any data in it, right? Because we haven't created anything. But we just finished this endpoint, so I should be able to click send, and hopefully we'll get back the newly created to-do list item, which is this. And then if I go back to the actual MongoDB Atlas, if I were to do a refresh or apply, I think I might need to do a apply and just see what happens. We see that there's actually a piece of data stored on the remote Mongo instance, right? So we've actually successfully stored some data on MongoDB. And if you were to go back and hit the other endpoint we had, so remember, if you do a GET request on this endpoint, it's going to return us back every to-do list item that's in our database. So we have an array that comes back and we have one object in it. So now we've implemented the create and the read from the whole convention of CRUD. One thing I think we're missing is we probably want to say completed as false. Every time you create a new to-do list item, it probably makes sense to not have it be completed. So just set that to false, or default it to false. And again, you can default it in your model itself if you wanted to. So let's move on. Let's try to add the endpoints for the update and delete. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new route. And I'm just going to copy this file this time to kind of save some time. I'm going to rename it to update to do route. So this one is going to be a little bit different. We're going to learn some new things in Express that we haven't really seen before. So if I go to my router, typically with REST, if you want to update something, you want to do either a put or a patch request. In our case, we're just going to do a put. And then typically the convention is you need to provide the ID of the resource that you're trying to update. So if someone does a put request to to-dos of ID of let's say this, if they were to do a request, a put request, and they said they want this to do item to now be clean your room with an exclamation mark and completed is true, this is like the request that we'd expect a user to be able to do. So we're going to try to implement out this endpoint and have it actually update the data on Mongo. So let's just go ahead and make sure that we're importing the correct one. I'm going to say update to-do route. And I'll be honest, I don't like how I'm requiring here. I don't even know why I did this. I'm going to go ahead and up at the top, I'm going to require these. So update to-do route. I'm going to do this. And I'm also going to bring in the create. I'll do this, create, and I'm going to read. Right, I would never do a require inline. I don't even know why I did that. But let's just go ahead and replace this and refactor it real quick to make it more clean. All right. So hopefully I didn't break anything. It should still be good. I mean, we're just changing where we're importing this. So let's try to implement this put endpoint. So if I were to look at this update to-do route, there's different ways you can do this in Mongoose. I'm just going to show you one way, but I mean, if you find a better, more efficient way, you can do it that way. There's no right or wrong way to do stuff. So when we have a request, remember the router has this :ID. If I go to the router real quick, we need to know what the ID is of the URL the person is trying to send in, right? So if I go back to the route, when you're using Express, the way you can get that ID is you can say rec.params, like this, and get the ID from that. So this is going to be that ID that I showed you in Postman over here. That'll be the 629 if I were to actually send this request. And what we want to do is we want to find by ID and go ahead and pass it that ID. And we should get back that to-do item that is represented by that unique ID. And what we could also do is, again, this is the U from CRUD, the update. So we want to actually update this to-do item to have the latest and greatest data from whatever the payload that was sent in. All right, so if we wanted to update this to-do item, what we could do is we could say, just basically modify the item in place. So I could say to-do completed is equal to rec.body.completed. And then same thing with the text, right? So I'm going to do that. And then once you've changed whatever you want on the record, you can just await to-do.save. Okay, and that's going to save the record. And then we are going to return that record back to the user. So this is one way you can do it. If you have a bunch of different parameters, you can do like an object.assign if you want to. But let's just go ahead and make sure this works. So again, we're adding an exclamation mark to this to-do item, and we're going to set it equal to completed true. So if I click send, that should hit our new endpoint, and it said could not get a response. So let's go back and figure out what did we maybe break. So to do completed, cannot set properties of null, setting completed. So I think the issue is this actually needs to be params, not param. So sometimes it's always good to console log stuff out while you're doing some work, or if you're using something like TypeScript that would have just told me that I was doing that wrong. But that is the business of dealing with JavaScript. Sometimes you misspell stuff and you do stuff incorrectly. So now we've updated this item, and you can see we got back the updated item with the exclamation mark and completed true. And you can kind of further verify that it works by just doing a GET request. So I'll do a GET request. I want to make sure that this gets the latest data, which it does. And then finally, you can also go back to your Mongodb Atlas and just redo a search and make sure that your stuff has been updated on your MongoDB Atlas. All right, so the last CRUD endpoint, right? That's the delete. So the way to do that is I'm actually just going to copy and paste the update because it does follow a very similar pattern in regards to like the ID. So I'm going to call this one remove to do route. I'm also going to rename this one to update to-dos, because really we're not updating a plural to-dos, we're updating one. So I'm just going to go ahead and rename that one and make sure I don't forget to go in here, and I need to fix that and not put an S. So in the router, let's just go ahead and add a remove. Well, technically this would be a delete, right? So CRUD, I need to use the word delete. So sorry about that. I'm kind of, let me slow down and make sure I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing correctly. So this should be a delete. We imported it up here, and then we are going to make a new endpoint that takes in a delete request, right? So before we, go down that path, I want to show you what I mean by that. So going back here, you can change this request method to delete. And if you were to pass in / the 629 ID here, if I do send, then it should delete this from the database. That's what we're trying to achieve right now. All right, so we have the delete URL. This accepts a ID for the params, and I want to make sure I'm calling the right method here. So I'm going to say delete Todo Route. Save this file, and I'm going to go into that file for deleting. And like I said, this is similar logic. You basically use the ID. You can find the to-do using the ID, but then you can say await todo.remove, and that'll actually remove that from the backend, right? And typically when that happens, you want to do a res.status of 204, and you could just send back the to-do item that was deleted if you wanted to. So let's verify this works. I'm going to go ahead and click on send. I think technically you could do a status of 200, and then if the item has already been deleted, then you do a 204. I'm not going to get too strict about like your REST status codes. It's up to you to kind of go and read it more about status codes. But let's just go ahead and click send, and that should hopefully delete that to-do item. We got a 204 no content, which means everything was bad. Everything was good, not bad. And again, if you go back to Mongodb Atlas and click apply, you'll notice that there's no more items here. The items have been cleared out, and there's no more to-do list items. So we have successfully created the 4 CRUD methods that we are going to need to implement the UI for to-do list application. We have create, we have read, we have update, and delete. And there's also, you can technically do a read 1. If you just wanted to get back the information for a single to-do list item, we could add another route, but we're not going to do that in this tutorial. But yeah, hopefully you have a good understanding of how you can set up an Express application, add a little bit of authentication to your endpoints, and then start creating some CRUD methods for creating, reading, updating, and deleting items from MongoDB. Okay, so even though we're using MongoDB Atlas, the approach is still going to be the same with this Mongoose library that we're using. You're just going to be connecting to a local running instance. So instead of pointing to a remote URL, you're probably going to have like localhost 27017 here. So I'm going to commit what we got, and then we could probably start working on the UI. All right, so the next part is, let's just go ahead and make a new folder called client. And like I mentioned before, I like to separate my client from my server, especially if you're doing a single page application approach. So in this terminal down here, I'm keeping the server running so we can keep on connecting to it and make requests against it. But over here, I have a new terminal called client, and we need to set up a React application. So there's a couple ways you can do this these days. You can use create React app. You could use next. I'm actually going to use something called Vite. I'm going to say npm create Vite. And I'm going to go ahead and just put a dot. And what that's going to do is give me like a prompt where I can kind of walk through what I'm building. I'm going to say the project name is MERN to do. It's going to ask you what type of application you want to build. I'm going to say React. And then it's going to ask you, do you want TypeScript? I'm going to say no. And once that's done, you could simply say npm I to install all of the packages that are needed for this React application. So you might want to ask, okay, so what is Vite? Vite is a build tool similar to Webpack, but it uses something called ES build under the hood, I believe. So it's a lot faster than Webpack, and I like using it better than create React app, just because it's a little bit easier to configure in the future if you need to. But it doesn't really matter which one you pick. We're just going to pick one. The main point is learn how to do the React coding. Okay, so that's what you need to focus on. Don't worry about if you're using Vite or create React app. So now that that's done running, I'm going to say npm run, I believe it's dev. And just to kind of give you a reminder of why this works, if you look at the package.json, there is a script section, and that has a dev command. So I can say npm run dev. And that should run Vite, which will basically compile our React application. If I go to it here, notice that we have a React app. Okay, so at this point, we're pretty good to go. I'm going to go ahead and install 2 other dependencies that we're going to need in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel this, and I'm going to say npm I save, and then I'm going to say React query, and I'm also going to say React spinners. And I'll explain what those packages kind of do when we actually use them in the future, but I just want to have them installed so they don't waste time later installing them. All right, so let's just go ahead and rerun that React application by doing npm run dev. And make sure your page kind of refreshes and works. So when you do a Vite create application, you're going to get a lot of files, and the ones you have to really worry about is app.jsx. This is like where the React application kind of starts, where you have your main app component. And as you can see here, it has like a hello Vite plus React. It has a counter. It has some other stuff as well. So we can kind of get rid of all of this code because we're going to write our own custom code here. So let's delete that, delete the counter, and delete the SVG, and go ahead and save. Now, there's also another file that's kind of important to know about. It's main.jsx. This is kind of your entry point. Remember I talked about entry point a while back. It's like the main file that loads and sets up everything else. So main.jsx is the entry point when you're doing a Vite React application. And you can see here it basically tells React to take this JSX and render it to an element called root. Okay, so let's take a step further. What does it mean by root? Well, there is an element probably in this index file. Let's go ahead and look at that, which has an ID of root. So React is going to basically put all of its DOM elements right in here. And then if you go back to main, it's taking this JSX, it's going to convert it to HTML and, do what it needs to do behind the scenes to make this all work. And it puts that in that location here on the DOM. All right, so the first thing that we want to do is when this application loads, we want to fetch all of the to-do list items from that backend API that we have running on port 8080. So before I do that, I do want to kind of talk a little bit about React in case you're kind of unfamiliar with it. So the way React works is there is a class component approach and there is a functional component approach. We are going to be doing the functional components, which basically all your components are made up of just a function. So any of these JSX files, this is where you have your component set up, and you can create a function and then simply export it down here to be able to import it in other files. One thing that's important to point out that's different from the React or the Node.js backend is that this uses ES6 modules, I believe it's called, and this has a completely different syntax. So instead of using the require keyword, this uses an import keyword to bring in third-party packages and files. And then we have an export space default keyword to kind of export the object or the function that you're trying to export for others to use. And so what happens is as you write out your HTML, React is going to take this component, it's going to render it and convert it to HTML and display it on the page. So as you kind of make changes here, and you save the file, you'll notice that the page actually reflects those changes here. So what do we want to do? Well, in the app.jsx file, we want to basically fetch some data when this component first is created, or what we call as mounts. And the way to do that in React is you have these things called hooks. And hooks are just functions you can kind of use on your component to hook into the underlying life cycle of React. So when we say life cycle, we mean like when a component is created, when it's updated, or when it's deleted. So to hook into when this component is created or when it mounts, you have to use a hook called useEffect. So I'm going to go ahead and import a hook called useEffect from React like this. And we can then call it inside app.jsx like so. And I do want to say it's kind of confusing when you first start using this. It's not really that intuitive, but the way it works is that useEffect takes two arguments. The first one is going to be a callback function where you can tell it what to do when the component mounts. And then the second argument is a dependency array, which when you start putting values in here, it's going to rerun this hook every time React re-renders. So let's just go ahead and put a console log here just to show what happens. And I want to demonstrate that this console log will only happen once because this component is just going to mount once. And actually, I should probably rephrase what I just said, because when you're using React 18, and more specifically, if you're using something called strict mode, which Vite does by default, the hook is going to be invoked twice, right? So whatever you put inside of this code here is going to be called twice when the component mounts. It's kind of strange, but they did that for a reason. I'm not going to get into the details of that. But what we want to do is when this component first runs, we want to download that data. Like we want to download all the to-do list items and put them somewhere, okay? So I'm going to make a new folder here called APIs, or just call it API. And I'm going to make a new file called read to-dos request.js. Okay, so what this file is going to do is we need to have this fetch the data from our server. So I'm going to go ahead and say export default, and that's going to export a function, which is going to return fetch. And what we're going to do is we need to fetch data from that local API. So up at the top here, I'm going to say const API URL is equal to HTTP localhost 8080. And I'm going to go ahead and use that here. So I'm going to say fetch from localhost or API URL / to-dos. So what this is going to do, this fetch thing is kind of built into the browser. It's a function you can use to make an actual like network request. So if you call fetch and pass it a URL, by default, it's going to do a GET request to this URL. And we already saw, like before, using Postman, if you do a GET request to this URL, it's going to return us an array of to-do items. So also when using the fetch command, you have to do this, where you basically do some promise chaining. By the way, I don't know if I talked about what a promise is, but basically it's a object that has a .then function, and you can call the .then function to basically run some code when this thing is done getting the response back from the server. So in our case, we have to do this .then response, and then we have to tell this code to return the JSON that came back from the request, right? Because there's other methods here. There's like text, I think there's like blob. So we want to, explicitly say we just want the JSON format back. And then once we do that, we can actually use this method from our app.jsx component. So over here, I'm going to go ahead and import that file. I'm going to say read to-dos request like this. And when this component mounts in the useEffect, I'm going to go ahead and just invoke it. And again, this is a promise chain. Something that's kind of strange about useEffect is you can't put an async here. You have to like either do promise chaining, or you have to do some kind of hacky approach to like add a function inside this useEffect that's async. Like I'd have to say const main is equal to async a function, and then I'd have to call it like this, right? So if you want to do async await, you'd have to do this. I don't think there is a benefit to using async await at this point, so I'm just going to do promise chaining. So let's just go ahead and show you real quick. So this should have like all to-dos, and I want to console log this out just to kind of show you what is happening here. So let's go ahead and say this. I'm going to go back to my browser. I'm going to go to the network tab. And one thing you'll notice is that we do get an unauthorized request because we haven't set a token, right? So we do need to set that authorization header. So for right now, I'm going to hard code that. Let's go over here to headers, and I'm going to go ahead and copy this token. And then inside of the request here, I'm going to go ahead and inside the fetch, I'm going to go ahead and pass it some options. So I could say method get, and I could say headers is equal to authorization. Like this. And for right now, I'm just going to go ahead and hard code a token here, but we're going to kind of refactor that later. And I think we can also do a content type. Let me go ahead and do this. And if this all works as expected, we should now get back some to-do list icons. I'm getting a 403 forbidden, so there must be something wrong with the token that I'm passing in. Okay, yeah, so I didn't mean to put bearer in there. Let me take out bearer from that string and just go ahead and try it again. And notice that we do get back some to-dos. It's empty right now because I guess there's none in the database, but we do get back some results. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go back and create one. So if I go back to Postman, I'm going to go ahead and say do a post to the to-dos, and I'm going to pass one in like this. So now if I go back to the UI and refresh this page, we should at least get back one to-do. So if I go to the network request and click preview, we see that we have one to-do list item. So now what we want to do is we want to display that on the page. And I'm going to go back to the code here and just go back to app.jsx. And let's try to show how you can do that. So in React, in order to display stuff to the page, you need to use something called state typically. And when you're using state, you have to use another hook called useState. So let's just go ahead and bring in a useState hook here. And we want to kind of cache or keep track of all the to-dos that came back and put them in state so that React knows when to re-render this component and display it down here. So I'm going to go ahead and say const to-dos and set to-dos equals useState. The way this hook works is you pass it some initial state, and then it's going to return you an array of 2 items. This is also kind of confusing when you first see this, but the first element of this array is your actual state variable. So this will hold all the to-dos that came back from the backend. And then your second index in the array is a setter function you can use to kind of update this state that's being stored. So instead of doing .then and console logging, let's just go ahead and set the state. So now when this code runs, it's going to take that request response that came back, put it in state, and we can use that state variable to kind of loop over and render out all the to-do items. So let me just show you how to do that. I'm going to say to-dos map, and I'm going to go ahead and just render out a div. And I'm going to say to-do.text, and I believe we say to-do.completed, like this. All right, so this is how we kind of render out or loop over a collection in React.jsx. You basically just do a normal JavaScript map function, and that map function needs to return some DOM elements, all right, or some other JSX or some other components. So in this case, for all the to-dos we get back from the backend, we're just going to render out the text and then also render out true or false if it's completed or not. Now, sometimes when you do that, you'll get warnings saying that every child should have a unique key property. So let's go back and make sure that this div has a key here. And I'm going to say to-do.text. This is probably the best approach. You would probably actually want to do to-do of ID. So let's do that. And another thing that you might have saw is that completed was not printing out to the page, because sometimes with Booleans and JSX, you actually need to interpolate it like this. But we're going to refactor all of this later into another child component, so don't worry too much about the approach of this. All right, so notice here we have clean your room and false. And then if we were to go back to our backend and just add another to-do list item like this, you will see that if I refresh my page, we get back 2 items now. All right, so I'm actually going to bring in something called React Query now and show you how to do that. and like kind of explain how to use it and what its purpose. So when you're building out larger scale applications, what you typically need to do is show spinners when stuff is trying to load from your backend, because your backend might take half a second or a second to fully respond, and then that has to travel, the data has to travel across the internet to your computer, right? So you might just have a page that just sits there after you click a button and not display anything because there's some latency or some delay. So the idea is you can use this library called React Query to basically do kind of what we're doing here with state, right? You can allow this React Query library to keep track of state so that you don't have to do all this additional like loading stuff by hand. You might say that, okay, using React Query in a tutorial is a little bit overkill, but I think it's important to understand because when you start building a real production system, you're more than likely going to have to implement either the same features or use React Query that allows you to just get that stuff out of the box. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, over here, I'm going to say const is loading data.todos, and I'm going to say equals use query. So use query is a method that comes from React Query. I'm going to go ahead and auto import that, and hopefully that shows up. It does not. So I'm going to say import use query from React Query. Let me go ahead and React Query. So this is a method that you call, and it takes two arguments. The first one is like a special key that you plan to cache your data in. So I'm going to put todos. And then the second one is going to be a callback. So the callback function needs to return the actual data. So we've already done that here. Let's just go ahead and do read todos. So I can actually just put that right directly in my query, I believe. And now we don't need state because React Query under the hood has its own state. And I believe we don't need the effect anymore because when the page mounts, it's going to automatically fetch that data. So we can actually remove the useEffect and use state. And I believe what will happen is this will just fetch the data when the application loads. But there is one thing I forgot to set up. So in order for a React query to work, you do have to go to main.jsx, and we have to kind of wrap our application with some stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and put, I'm going to wrap this app with a provider. So we haven't really talked about what providers are, but it's a way to kind of wrap your JSX components to give them more functionality. So I'm going to go ahead and just wrap this in a React query provider like this. And now we should have the ability to use React Query inside of all of our components, right? We might not dive more deeper into how context works. I believe this is just a context thing or some type of provider or higher order component, but that's how you kind of have to get it set up. And if I go back to app.jsx and I look at the page, we are getting another error. And the issue with this is because React is trying to render out todos, but todos is not even defined right now. So luckily we get back this is loading thing. So I can actually say if the app is loading, and this is a ternary operator. This is kind of like what a lot of people do in React to show a spinner or show the actual content. So if something's loading, I'm going to go ahead and show a spinner. So in this case, I'll just say div loading ... for now. Otherwise, we can show all the to-do list items. So that'll prevent that error from happening because we don't want React to try to render over or call .map on an undefined thing. So let me just show you real quick. If I refresh this page, you should see loading pop up for a little bit, like really quick. And then when the data comes back from the backend, it shows the actual data. I'm going to take this one step further. I have that library we installed when we first started this project called clip loader. And instead of just printing out the string loading, I'm going to go ahead and make a clip loader of, I'm going to pass it a property called size. We haven't really talked about what properties are, but if you need to pass special data to your components, you can do that like this. You just define the attribute, very similar to HTML. You define the attribute, and then you define a curly brace and say like what value you want to pass that component. All right, so if we go back to the UI and just go ahead and refresh, at this point, we should hopefully see a spinner show up, and then we get some data back. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to work on the actual to-do list item here, where basically we need to display like a checkbox for the user. an input box so they can actually change the text of the to-do item, and then maybe add like a delete button. So let's try to do that. What I'm going to do is in the source folder, the convention a lot of people do is they'll put a components folder like this, and then they'll put the component that they're trying to do. So I'll say TodoItem.jsx. And inside of that file, I'm going to go ahead and just create a React component. And what we want to do is instead of mapping over and doing all of this like JSX in this file, it would be nice if this was all extracted away and put into the to-do item. So I'm going to go ahead and put this here. Technically, we could just get rid of the key. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. And for this to work, you need to pass in the actual to-do model, right? So in React, this is how you can pass props. You basically, whatever the argument is for the React component, like this is all your props. And we typically just do array destructuring to get back what we want to pass in. So for an example, if I were to pass in to-do, how would this look like in the app.jsx? Well, first of all, we have to import to-do item. And then to pass that prop in, we'd have to do something like this. So we can pass the full to-do object to that child component. And then we also want to set the key to this to maybe be that Mongoose or Mongo ID. So let's go back, make sure this still renders and works fine, and it does. So if we go back to this to-do item, there's a couple of things we need to change so that the user can first of all check on a checkbox. So let's just start on that. Let's I'm gonna go ahead and add an input, and I'm gonna say type is checkbox. And that should display a checkbox on the page somewhere, right? So when they can now click on it and do stuff. But we need to hook React into this checkbox to know when it was actually checked. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say on change, we are going to call a method called complete, or I'm going to say toggle completion, I guess. And up here at the top, I'm going to make a function called toggle completion. And what this could basically do is make a request to the backend to complete the to-do list item. And we kind of need to refetch all the to-dos or just refetch this one to-do list item. And there's a way to do that with React Query, which I'll probably show you. But before we kind of implement this logic, we need to add an API endpoint here. So I'm going to go ahead and say update to-do request. And this one is going to be very similar to the last read to-dos request. So I'm going to go ahead and copy some of this code. And we probably want to extract away some of these common variables into a config file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new file as well called config.js. You could also use Vite environment variables if you want to, but I'm just going to do this because it's just easier at this point. So I'm going to copy those two things into this file so that we can use them in the other files. And I'm going to go ahead and save this and make sure I import API URL. And then I'm going to also import token from that file. And I can do the same approach with the other file, the read to-dos. I'm going to go up here, delete that code, and import those variables from the config. So let's go back to update to-do request. What we need to do here is remember the endpoint for updating a to-do. It requires an ID. So I'm going to go ahead and say todo.id. And this could take in a to-do object, I guess. And what we want to do is we want to pass in a body. So here we can say body, and then typically you say json.stringify. And we could stringify, I'm just going to pass in text of to-do.text and completed of to-do.completed. All right. So assuming that we did this correctly, this is going to make a put request. Make sure you update that to put, because remember the backend is expecting a put here. And we're going to kind of just overwrite the existing to-do item with this new data. And I'll just go ahead and save this, and we should be able to try it out and see what happens. So in the TodoItem.jsx component, what we want to do is we want to basically call that endpoint when the to-do item changes. But since we're using React Query, there are some helper methods that kind of do that. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a I'm going to say query client. Go ahead and bring that in, and I believe I need to auto import that. So make sure you auto import that from React Query. Actually, I'm not sure why that's, oh, I think it's called like use query client. Let's see, use query client. This is just a React hook or a React query hook you can use. And you need this when you're doing some type of like more complex mutations, or you need to kind of invalidate your cache. I didn't really talk about that too much, but maybe I'll mention what the cache is. So what we're going to also do with React Query is that there's a method called useMutation. And this is similar to useQuery, but it's used for like updating items. So I'm going to do a const, and then I'm going to say mutate. And then I will say toggle completion is equal to useMutation. And that is going to take a function like so. And what we're going to do is we're going to call that endpoint we just created, which was update to do request. And we're going to pass it the to-do item like this. So assuming we got this right, when they click on this thing, this is going to call update to do request. And then it's going to update the to-do request, but I need to make sure that I do completed is equal to the negation of to-do.completed, if that makes sense. So we need to toggle it every time you click it. And we don't need React Query right now, but let's just verify this works. And then the second thing that we need to do is we have to actually bind this input box to the completed Boolean. So here I'll say checked is equal to to-do.completed. So if this is true, it should make this input box checked. If it's not true, then it'll keep it unchecked. So going back to the UI, let's fix any bugs if there are any bugs. It looks like there might be one issue with something, but we don't have to worry about that right now. So if I click on this checkbox, it should at least try to make a backend request. If you click on this request, notice that it's sent back completed true, which is good. Everything's working, but the issue is that the UI didn't actually update. So if I refresh this page, that's when it should show that it was checked. So there's like a little issue with we're not updating the actual React state. Luckily, there is a way to do that with React Query, because remember, the state of the to-do list items are stored in React Query. So there is a second object options that you could pass in to this useMutation, and I want to put on settled. Right, so when this thing is settled, what we're going to do is we're going to invalidate the query client cache. So I think it's called invalidate. Let's see what GitHub Copilot tells me. I think it's called invalidate queries of to-dos. So if you remember, when the app loaded, let's go over here. We told it to cache all the to-do list items in a cache of key to-dos. Okay, so that's React Query behind the scenes, is keeping track of those to-do list items. And when they change, we need to make sure that we invalidate the cache so that React Query knows to refetch all the to-do items and refresh the page. Now, this probably isn't the most performant way to do this with a to-do list app. We probably just want to update a single item and find that and update that cache instead of doing the entire. But let me just go ahead and uncomment that one so we can do it. So let me just show you what happens on this change, okay? So if I clear out the console, if I click on this checkbox, notice that it does make a request to the backend to update the checkbox. But then directly after, it's going to invalidate the cache of React Query, and it's going to refetch all the to-dos. Something that's also really cool with React Query is if I were to make a new to-do list item from like Postman, let me just go ahead and do this. So I'll make like 1, 2 items. The cool thing about React Query is that when you refocus your window, your queries are going to fire off again to get the latest server state. So if I go back to my UI, notice that when my UI comes into view, those items already showed up for me, because the way React Query works is that when the browser regains focus, it's going to fire off your request to get back the latest state of the queries. So that's really convenient, and it kind of allows your UI to act like it's live, which is convenient. All right, so the next thing is we need to kind of update the text here. So if I go back to the page, probably zoom in a little bit. If I go back to the page here, Let's add another input box here. I'm gonna go ahead and put another input. And instead of having completed here, I'm gonna say text. This is gonna be a type input of input. Or is it called text? I forget. I think it's called text. And then when this thing changes, I'm gonna say update text. All right. So this thing will have to have a function that we declare up here. So at the top, I'll say const update text. That takes in an E. Anytime that you have an event listener on an input, you typically get back an event object like this. And what we want to do is we want to say const new text is equal to that. But I'm going to go ahead and fire a mutation again. So instead of this mutate being toggle completion, I think what we actually want to do is we want to pass in the updated to do here. And we can just go ahead and send that. All right, so I'm doing a little bit of refactoring because I think it's strange that this mutation is toggling the completed. So let's just go ahead and delete that. You can also kind of clean up some code here as well. So let me do that. All right, so the idea was like when you actually click on the checkbox, what we want to do now is just call update to do. And we are going to basically do ... to do. And then I'm going to say completed is equal to the negation of completed, to do completed. Ooh, I can't speak right now. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to do that same approach down here. And that's going to take in an E. But instead of completed, we're going to say text e.target.value. And in fact, I decided we don't even need this function anymore. So let's save this and see what happens as well. So there is an issue. These things are initializing with blank for the value. But really what we want to do is we want to put a binding here. I'm going to say value is equal to do.text. And we don't want the checked because this isn't a type checkbox. This is a type text. So when this component loads, we want to put the actual text into the input boxes. So let's try this out. If I were to go ahead and delete some stuff, notice that it's making requests to the backend and it's updating those things as we change them. Pretty cool. There is another thing that we want to do, and that is to basically give the ability to delete to-do items. So let's add another button here underneath all these inputs. I'm going to say button. I'll say delete. And again, when you click on this thing, we're going to have to call a function. So let's just go ahead and add an on click. I'm going to say delete to do. And we're going to make a function up here at the top, which is going to be called delete to do. So const delete to do. And we are going to basically have to call that delete endpoint. Remember the CRUD methods we created? Well, one of them is delete. So we have to make a new API method over here called delete to do request. And I'm going to go ahead and copy the update to do because it's going to be kind of similar. I'm going to go ahead and just paste this in here. And then I'm going to do a delete request to that endpoint. And this delete request doesn't need a body, so I can just delete the body. For this one to also work, we're going to have to add another used mutation to basically create a delete method. So instead of making this custom method down here, I'm going to go ahead and make another one called delete to do and delete this. And instead of saying update to do request, we are going to say delete to do request. Okay. And this delete method takes in a to do item, so everything should be good. And we are going to basically call it down here. I believe we already do that. On click delete to do. Oops, let's see. Yeah, so we need to call the actual mutate method, which is delete to do. But this one actually requires an argument. So let's go ahead and pass that in an anonymous function. And I'm going to say to do. All right, so let's give that a shot and see if we have any bugs or if that works. Now, if I were to click on this one, it's going to delete that from the backend. If you look here, we did a delete request. One of these was a delete request. I guess it was this one. So we did a delete request here and we removed it from the backend. There was a little error. I'm not really sure what the error was about. Unexpected end of JSON delete to do request. So if we look at here, I guess there is no JSON that comes back. So technically we don't even need to like do that. We can just do the delete and then it should just work. So let's just go ahead and verify this still works. Let's click delete and that gets deleted. Kind of one of the last steps is we need to add an input here with a create button. So let's add a new form, a new component called create to do form.jsx. And we are going to basically create a form here that is going to, let me change this to a form. And we are going to add an input box of type text and then also a button that says create. All right, so very similar to the other approaches where we did React queries and stuff like that. What we want to do is, again, we need to bring in some of these hooks and stuff so we can do some mutations again. And we are going to basically, let me make sure to auto import this stuff. All right, create to do form. I'm going to say create to do is the mutation, and that's going to call an endpoint called create to do request. We haven't created this method yet, but I'm going to go ahead and just put out the, the placeholder for all this. I'm going to make a new API here called create to do request.js. And that's going to be kind of similar to update, kind of, not really, but we're going to go ahead and just copy this code and put it directly here. And we need to basically hit the /todos endpoint. There's no need for an ID. We need to do a post request. We need to stringify the to do. So that's all fine. So this should work. Let's go ahead and go back to our component that we're trying to create. And when someone tries to basically submit the form, let me go ahead and auto import this one, create to do request, import create to do request from /API create to do request. Actually, I think this is not a named export. All right, so if everything is working, we should be able to basically add an on submit function here. And we're going to make that pass in a callback where we say e.prevent default. Basically, e.prevent default prevents the page from refreshing. That's typically how HTML forms work when you submit. It's going to refresh the page. But what we want to do is prevent that refresh from happening. But then we want to call create to do. All right, so the question is what do we put inside of this create to do? Well, we need some text, but we don't have text stored anywhere, right? So we need some state. I'm going to go ahead and go up here and I'm going to say const text and then set text is equal to useState. So we need to keep track of some state when the user types into the input. So let's just go ahead and go down to that input box and I'm going to say onChange is equal to e and then set text of e.target.value. So whenever someone types into this input box, we're basically updating state. And then when we submit the form, it should use that latest version of that state variable and send that over to the backend. Now, one thing I forgot, if you go back to create to do request, I'm going to go ahead and just hard code this to false. There's no need to like have that be true when you first create your to do. So yeah, hopefully that is all set up good. We'll probably have a bug or two, but we haven't actually imported that in our main app. So let's go back to app.jsx. And after all the to-do lists are kind of rendered, what I'm going to go ahead and do is just display that form. So I'll say create to do form, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure I auto import that, which, okay, there we go. All right, so when the page loads, it crashes because create to do form useState is not defined. So let's go back to create to do form. And I forgot to auto import the useState from React, which for some reason my auto import doesn't ever work with the React imports. So let's just go ahead and do that. All right, so now let's verify that this works. So I'm gonna go ahead and type in like hello world and click enter on my keyboard. And that created the to-do item and it sent it to the backend. One thing we forgot to do is clear out the state. You want to probably start with a blank state a blank text every time you submit. So we'll create to do, and then I'm gonna say set text is equal to an empty array. And one thing we probably also want to do is don't create to-dos with no text. So I'm gonna say if no text, then I'm gonna say return. All right, so let's try this again. Let's just go ahead and click create, and that should have cleared out the form, but maybe I forgot to do something. Create to-do form, create the to-do, set the text equal to an empty string. Okay, the issue is because I didn't bind this. So make sure on the input box, you definitely bind it to your state variable, or else you're not going to see it get updated when you change state. So let's go ahead and type something in, click create, that gets cleared out, and we can go ahead and delete some of these. Yeah, so I mean, the last step is kind of just some finishing touches. Like it'd be cool to add maybe a heading here that says like MERN to do app. Okay. So let's just go ahead and print that out. And then we could add some cool gradient to the background if you wanted to like make this look interesting. So I'm going to say CSS gradient generator. And go ahead and just find a random gradient that's not too dark. And let's just go ahead and copy this. I'm going to copy this to the clipboard. I'm going to go to the index CSS. And inside the body, I'm just going to paste this in. All right, so that should apply a gradient to the entire page. So if we go back to the to-do list app, we have a gradient here, and it'd be nice to make this text white because it's kind of hard to read. So I'm going to say color white. There we go. We got a little basic to-do list application where you can create items, you can check items, uncheck them, delete them, and the state is persisted on our MERN backend. And if you want to take this a step further, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do in React Query. One of the things is called optimistic updates, where if you notice, sometimes when I click on create to do or I delete, it delays, like there's like a half a second delay or less. You can do an optimistic update where you basically clear out that value, you delete that value from React Query state, you do the request to the backend, and when the request comes back, if it was successful, then you don't need to do anything. But if it failed, you can maybe show an alert saying that something went wrong. You can go ahead and delete that record. So it's kind of more important for like slower networks. So if I were to say fast 3G and click delete, you'll see that the page kind of just sits here and doesn't do anything for a second. That's not the best user experience. You want that item to just instantly be removed. But again, there's some latency in between me, this UI, the server, and the Mongodb Atlas instance, right? So you can't just, it's not going to be instant unless you actually add that logic in. Again, with creating as well, like you could do optimistic updates there, same with updating and deleting, but we're not going to go down that path of talking about that too much. So one thing that I did notice there's a little bug with is that as you keep typing into this input, I think it's going to keep on doing requests to your backend and then like updating what you're typing. So it's kind of a pain. One approach that you can do is you can put a debounce on this so it doesn't try to update this every single time you type into it. So let's go back to update to do. Where's the to do item? Let's go back to do item. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to wrap this to do delete or delete. Sorry, not this one. The update to do in a debounce. So hopefully this is not too advanced, but I'm going to import a package called Lodash. I'm going to say npm install save Lodash. And Lodash has a method called debounce. So I'm going to go ahead and say import debounce from Lodash. Now the issue is every time a user types into the input box, you don't want to keep making requests to the backend because that's a lot of data that you keep sending to the backend. And if you're using like something like Lambda, you're going to be charged per Lambda execution. So instead of like sending this over to the backend as often as possible, what I'm going to do instead is use a debounce function to basically wrap this update to do. So I'm going to say const debounced update to do, and then we're going to do something called React use callback. Okay, so This is an optimization function you can do, and you can pass it in a function to basically not recreate the function every render. So the way React works, every time you change state, it's going to re-render your component, which is going to recreate all your functions. So all this stuff is going to rerun, and unless you're using like a custom hook, it's just going to recreate debounces and stuff like that. But the idea is we basically wrap update to do in a debounce, and we're going to wait a second before we actually send a request to the backend. And then what we're going to do, actually I'll make this like 600. And then what we can kind of do is just call that function instead when they type. So let's go ahead and find on change. And instead of calling update to do directly, we're going to call debounced update to do. And hopefully if I did that all correctly, let's look through here. Use callback is not defined. So I forgot to import that. Go ahead and import that from React like this and save this file. See if the page loads. So the idea is now when I type, I could do like hello. So I think there's still an issue with like the text. Basically, I think we need to not have it that the input box depend on updating after the state comes back in. All right, this is getting pretty complicated, but I think we just have to do this. So I'm going to extract the text to be its own state. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a text state variable here, and I'm going to say use state, and that's going to be equal to the initial text of that to-do item. Okay, so we're making a new state hook variable here, and this to-do item component is going to be in charge of keeping track of its own text state, I guess. And we're going to do a little bit of refactoring. So when we type into that input, instead of calling debounce update to do, we're actually just going to call set state of e.target.value. And we're going to cut this code out. And what that allows us to do is now we can actually just add a hook. Actually, let me change the value to text as well. So basically, when this component mounts, it's going to use the initial text from this, and then that's going to display in the input box. And when the user types into the input box, it's going to update the state instead of just keep on calling requests to the backend. This is kind of how we're going to do it to achieve the debounce. And then what we want to do is we're going to add another useEffect here, where basically we are going to keep track of whenever the text changes. So remember the second argument for useEffect is your dependencies array. Well, I want this to call a callback function every time someone types into this input box. And I want to say if the text is actually changed, so if text is not equal to to-do.text, then I'm going to go ahead and call that debounce update to do. So that should update the text on the backend. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and move this right above this other function just to keep it a little bit easier to understand. And I think I probably need to auto import this useEffect like so. I think I forgot to put an underscore ID here. That's kind of my bad. You know what I should have done is just done this. I really should have done this. So it would have been easier. So let's see if that actually fixes the issue. For some reason, every time I try to update my to-do item, it crashed, and it's because I was passing the wrong ID. So let's try refreshing and see what happens. I'm going to type in a letter, and hopefully that makes an update. Hello world. All right, there we go. I think that's working. All right, so we successfully, hopefully this code doesn't have a bug somewhere, but we successfully made it so the user can keep typing like, what is up? How is it going? And at the very end, when it's done, after waiting like half a second, it's then going to make the update to the backend. So we have some like applications, I mean, we have some component state that's keeping track of the text, and then we do a debounce to basically update that at a later point. So the final part of this application is I want to kind of build a login page with kind of authenticating with that backend login endpoint. So on the client, I'm going to go ahead and run npm install React router DOM at 6, just so that we have the ability to kind of set up a router on our React application. And once you have that installed, I'll have to go and look at the docs a little bit to kind of remember how to do this. All right, so I'm gonna import this browser router, and I believe you have to wrap your your application using the browser router. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this. And then I'm gonna go ahead and also, let me do this real quick. So once you've done that, basically you have access to a bunch of router hooks inside of your app component, and you can kind of call them as you need to. And then also what you can do in your app.js file is we can kind of copy these routes. And I'm going to go to app.jsx. So we're going to do a little bit of refactoring here inside the app.jsx file. I'm going to go ahead and paste those in. And I'm going to go ahead and take this stuff that we did for the to-do list application. I want to put this in a different component. In fact, I want to make a new folder called pages. And I'm going to make a new file in here called to-do page.jsx, right? We're going to want two different pages for kind of creating our to-do list app and the login page. So let's just go ahead and find out this code. And I'm going to paste it right here in the to-do page. And then what I'm also going to do is copy over a lot of the things that we had kind of set up. So such as the use query I need to bring over. And then let's just go ahead and copy a majority of all this stuff over, and we can delete the stuff that we don't think we're going to use. In fact, I'll just do this. Let's just go ahead and paste that in. And we did change this to a different level. This is nested in a pages, so we have to kind of go up a level for some of these components and API files. So I'm going to do that. And go ahead and move these third-party dependencies at the top, so it's easier to kind of differentiate between what is ours and what is a third-party dependency. So we have all this. This should still work. Going back to app.jsx, we imported routes. So let's just go ahead and auto import that. And I'm going to go ahead and auto import the route from React Router DOM. So if you haven't used React Router before, it's a way to basically specify if the user were to go to like /about, you can display a different React component. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the dashboard go to the to-do page. Go ahead and auto import that. And then I'm also going to do a login page. So I'm going to make a login page, and we're going to go ahead and go over here to pages. I'm going to say login page.jsx. Go ahead and scaffold that out. Go ahead and save that and make sure I come back here and auto import that. And actually the auto import did not actually load. Let me make sure I have the file open. Sometimes you have to have the file open to be able to do the auto importing. All right, so we have React Router set up. Hopefully this works fine. What we're going to do is we're going to go to our application over here. And I'm going to go ahead and just refresh the page and make sure that I can hit the login route. And then if I go to just the normal route to verify, we can hit the to-do list application. All right, so both of those are working. Now, one thing I want to do is if you aren't actually logged in, we don't want to show this to-do list application. So how do you achieve that? Well, there's a couple things we have to do. The first thing is we need to basically add a protected route on the to-do page. But before I do that, I think it would make more sense to work on the login page, because we're going to have to basically hit that login endpoint and save a token somewhere. I'm probably going to save it in React context. But let's just go ahead and go to the login page. And I'm going to go ahead and just add a state variable for password and set password. I'm going to say use state, and that's going to be equal to an empty string when it first initializes. And what we're going to do is add on this login page, I'm just going to add a h1 that says login, and then probably an input that says password. Luckily, GitHub Copilot kind of scaffolded all that out for us. But as the user types into this password field, it's going to basically update the state. I'm going to add a button here, and I'm going to call it login. And it'll make sense to wrap all of this in a form. So I'll do that. And then on the form, we want to basically do an on submit. And we can do like a handle login callback here. So let's just go ahead and do a const. The const handle login, that's going to take an E. And like we mentioned before, whenever you do a normal HTML form submission, it's going to refresh your page. So we do want to prevent default. And we are going to basically, so at this point, what we want to do is we want to hit our endpoint. Remember, we made a login endpoint. So let's go over to our API. I'm going to say login request.jsx, or sorry, JS. And let's just go ahead and copy the create because that also does a post. So we can kind of use this as our starting point. I'm going to go over to login request, go ahead, paste that in. And we want to hit the login page instead of /todos, and we want to pass in a password, right? So let's just go ahead and pretend like this function just takes in one argument, which is the password. And this one's a little bit different. So when you're dealing with fetch and your endpoint returns a non-200 status code, you kind of need to check it here. So I'm going to go ahead and just say if response.ok, then I'm going to go ahead and just return response.json. So if everything was good with the login, we submitted the right password, then we're going to just return the JSON. Otherwise, we're going to throw a new exception. So I'm going to say throw new error, and I'm going to say login failed. I don't think we also need the passive bearer token here, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that one. So hopefully this all works fine. We might have a bug or two, but what I'm going to do is on that login page, I want to import login request, and we want to invoke it when we try to handle the login. So I'm going to say, let's just do login request, and I'm going to call it with password. And what I'm going to do is if everything worked fine, so using promise chaining, I'm going to basically call a function if everything worked fine, but if there were any type of errors, I'm going to go ahead and do another callback here, doing a .catch. So with promise chaining, you can do a .then if everything was good, or if something threw an exception or an error, you can do a .catch. And what we want to do is if there's an error, we want to display that for the user. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this state, and I'm just going to make another one for set error. And we're just going to go ahead and say set error is equal to error.message. Okay, so if an exception was thrown, we're going to set that error, and then we just want to kind of display it here. So I'm going to make a div. So I'm just going to do some inline styles here and just make this red just to keep it simple. But we want to display the error if an error occurred. And then let's just go ahead and also, if the login was successful, we want to redirect the user to the dashboard, right? So what I'm going to do is, since we're using a React router, there's a hook you can bring in called useNavigate. So I'm going to say const navigate is equal to useNavigate. And this hook, let me just auto import that. I think it's called useNavigate. Let me just go ahead and say import useNavigate from React Router DOM. And you can call this method to make React kind of change views. So I'm going to go ahead and call navigate and just go to the dashboard. And then I think that should hopefully be good. We can kind of test this out and see how it works. And yeah, let's just go to the login page and see what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and go to /login. And I'm going to type in some bogus password. Remember, the real password is like ABC. So I'm going to say ABCD, click login, and we get an error back from the backend, 401 unauthorized. And you can see we're printing out that red error message. But if I type in ABC and do the request, everything worked good. We got redirected back to this page, and everything should be good. All right. So one thing I do want to do, though, is if you notice, when we hit the login endpoint, we get back a token, right? We want to store that token somewhere in our application state so that this page can use it, and we can also kind of check for it and prevent a user from hitting this page if they don't have a token set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to do that with context. There's different ways you can do this. You could bring in Redux, you can bring in like Zustan, you can use prop drilling in lifting state if you want to, but I'm just going to use context because I think it's the most easiest in this approach. So to use context, you can say const, and I'm going to say token context is equal to react.createContext. And I'm going to go ahead and set this equal to null. Make sure you also export it because you need to import it from other files. And make sure you import React because you have to kind of have that exist before you can use this. And the way context works is you basically declare some state. So I can say like token and set token here. And I'm going to go ahead and pass that, or a null for its initial value. And for every piece of subchildren or any subchild that wants to be able to access this state, you basically just need to wrap it with the provider like this. I'm going to go ahead and pass it token and set token. So now any of my children who want to use this provider, they have access to these two state variables, right? So it's kind of similar to prop drilling, where you have a piece of state defined at a higher level and you pass it in via props. But we're using context just so it's easier to kind of grab from the other components. So in the login page, let's just go ahead and try to use that context. I'm going to go ahead and say const token and set token. And I'm going to go ahead and say use context, auto import that. And I'm going to say token context and make sure I also auto import that from the app. So I'm say import token context from /app, because that's where we have it defined. And when you do that in a subcomponent that's kind of wrapped in that provider, you have access to whatever you decide to put inside of this value here. So anything that wants to use this context, again, will have access to this array. So it's very similar to state, but what we want to do is we want to call set token right here. Remember, this is going to pass back a token. So I can say set token of token. And now when I navigate to this page, we will have that token kind of stored on context and we can use it. But additionally, the router has access to this token as well. So what we can do is we can add a protected route for this page and don't let it display unless their token is set. So I'm going to make another function here called const protected route. And this function is basically going to use that same context to get the token. And let's not use this code. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say if the token is set, then what we could do is just we are going to call element like this. Oops, element. Otherwise, we are going to call a navigate to /login. Okay, so I'm going to kind of explain what I'm doing here, but basically element is going to be a prop that we pass in. So on the to-do page, we are going to do this. So we're going to say element protected route element of to-do page like this. And we are going to basically invoke that and return that to-do page if token was set. But if token wasn't set, we need to use React Router. This navigate component is kind of built into React Router to just force the page to change to whatever you want it to whenever this thing renders. So let's try that out. Hopefully I don't have any bugs, but I'm going to try to refresh this page and it should hopefully redirect me to the login page because we don't have a token set on context. But let's look at this. I think we might have a little bug. React Router does not provide an export name default. Yeah, so I was importing React here for some reason. I think my auto import got confused. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that and make sure I'm importing React from the right package and go back to my UI and refresh. Also, use context is not defined, so I need to go ahead and auto import this as well. So let's go ahead and save that. All right, here we go. So if you go to the dashboard, it redirects you back to the login page. That's exactly what we want. And if you were to log in successfully with ABC, we should be able to go to the dashboard page and it will not redirect us back to login because the token is set. So there's kind of like one more step to all this authentication stuff is you could kind of store this in local storage or wherever you want so that when you refresh the page, you continuously stay logged in. But the main thing is, remember in the API, we kind of hard-coded this token here. We actually need to change this. So I'm going to delete the token, and the token actually probably needs to be passed in as a parameter. So I'm going to go ahead and just pass in token here. There's probably a different way to do this, but I'm just going to do the first thing that comes to mind. So we are just going to pass in the token here. Actually, I think since this is a method that will live inside of a component, I think we can technically say const token is equal to use context. And I'm going to go ahead and try to bring in the token context. Let me just try this. I'm not really sure if this will work, but it's worth trying. Otherwise, we might have to pass in token every single time. So this should hopefully, if I were to try to create a to-do list item here, and just type in ABC and click create. Let's see what happens. Token context is not defined. I forgot to import this correctly from app. I think I forgot to save the file, maybe? I'm not sure why it's saying it's not defined. It should be defined at the top here. Let's go ahead and try it one more time. I'm going to type some stuff in and click create. Token context is not defined. Use context of token context. Oh, my bad. Yeah, so I have to go back through all this, and let's try doing the same approach where I probably need to pull this all from context at this point. So it's a little bit of overhead to, like, you know, auto import all this stuff, but we should get it done in like 2 seconds here, which shouldn't take too long. Hope this works. I hope I'm not just kind of wasting some time. I believe this is because we're calling this inside a component, so hopefully it'll work, but you never know. Maybe it won't, due to how hooks work in React. And this will kind of be embarrassing if it doesn't work. So, all right, let's see if we make any progress with that now. Let's go ahead and click refresh. See if the app loads. Delete to-do request, again, is missing something. So I think I need to not import token here. Update to-do request. Again, don't import token. Read. Let's try it again. All right, let's try it one more time. ABC, click login. We go here. And for some reason, nothing is returning. Cannot read map of undefined. So if I were to look at this, hooks can only be called inside the body of a function. Yeah, so what I expected is, you know, this doesn't work because you actually have to pass a token in. So we're going to have to, like, get the token context from app and all the other components and basically pass that in. So it's kind of a pain, I'll be honest with you all. So let me go ahead and refactor some of this code. So this will take in to do, and then it'll also take in a token. Go ahead and delete that. All right, I got two more left. So let's delete this one. This will take in a token now. Go ahead and save that one. And go ahead and delete this. Go ahead and delete this. So I will say that this is one thing I kind of don't like about, you know, the way React works. It's very hard to, like, just grab some state without it being, like, passed in. So let's go back to the to-do page. And anywhere that we're trying to make this request, like read to-do request, we actually need to pass in a token now. So what I'm gonna have to do is bring in that token context like this. So import those two things, and then I'm gonna go ahead and change this to be an anonymous function, and we're gonna pass in token here. And we're gonna have to do that same approach to anywhere else that we are potentially creating to-dos or querying for to-dos. So I'm gonna go to the create to-do form, and we also need to bring in the token here. This is pretty painful, but we're going to get through this. So this one also needs to take in a token as the second argument, I believe. And let's do the last component that we have, the to-do item. And by the way, if you're watching this and you have a better solution than what I'm doing, let me know. It seems kind of strange that I have to import the token everywhere just to be able to get this working, but I'm probably just having a brain fart, and it's probably like a very simple approach to getting this working. I just can't think of it right now. So let's just go back to the UI. Hopefully this all works. I'm going to go ahead and click ABC. We get redirected to this app. Go ahead and create some stuff. I'm going to go check some stuff, delete some stuff. It looks like this is all working now, and every request we do should be using that token that we got back from the login endpoint. All right, so that's about all I wanted to show you all. I kind of showed you, a decent amount about the MERN stack and showed you some routing with React Router DOM version 6. If you enjoyed watching this, be sure to leave me a comment below and let me know. Also, give me a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe if you're new to this channel. I also have a Discord channel where you can ask me questions directly if you would like to. So be sure to check that out. And have a good day and happy coding.